Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special crossover episode. What is this, a crossover episode? This episode will be sort of cross-podcasted on the podcasts of my co-hosts today. My conspirators today, Nestor from Black Banner Magic, the occult leftist podcast, and Brett O'Shea from Rev Left Radio, Revolutionary Left Radio. Both great shows you should check out if you are interested in all this stuff. Black Banner is a great show. I was the first ever guest on. It's about, lefty stuff and spooky stuff. Rev Left Radio, if you have not listened, is an incredible resource. One of the OG podcasts. I'm a huge fan of it. It's always great to work with Brett. Just a quick heads up. If you are a regular listener of our show, if you're listening to this on the Pod Damn America feed, then you will notice that this week's episodes are out of order. Usually our bonus episode is earlier in the week and our main episode, our public episode, is later. Well, I had to switch them around because what happened is I put a lot of work into this show and there's a lot of content in it, but there's extra stuff. The extra stuff is going to be the Patreon episode this week. So I had to put the main episode up first. That way it would make sense if you wanted to then go listen to the rest of it on the Patreon. Because chronologically, the stuff we'll talk about on the Patreon will come a little bit after. The Mexican Revolution is a long thing that ended badly, like Game of Thrones. It didn't really, happen. So so we got to the main meat of what we're talking about in today's episode, but then there's kind of more, and then there's also dumb shit that I thought of afterwards. But the main episode is here. All right. The other thing is that if you're a listener of our show and you bought merch, just wanted to give you guys a heads up. If you're wondering where it is, this is the first month that we've had our merch store up. And so for that reason, I think I'm still kicking the tires on this whole program. But our original plan was to mail out everything at the end of the month, beginning of the month. So it's going to happen soon. But if this is crazy, I don't know how people usually do this. Maybe I'll do it 2 times a month. I'm doing it less. I wanted to mail out all our shit at one day at the beginning of the month because I'm a coronavirus hero and not because I don't want to and I'm lazy and all that shit. Coronavirus hero. Okay. So anyways, I'm really happy with today's episode. This is something that I've wanted to research and make into a thing for a long time because, as we'll get into it, there is some personal history for me in the Mexican Revolution. It's pretty cool. And also, I think Nestor came upon some very interesting information that he might be the only person that I know that knows about, which is really cool, that relates to all this. So there's an interesting thing for us to vamp on. And also, Brett is a fucking really smart guy. And so he's going to serve as a bit of a rock for us to anchor ourselves off of in terms of just understanding the politics of the situation as we talk about this. Anyways, without further ado, enjoy the show.
Talk about the U.S. inflation. I understand just a little. No comprende, it's a riddle. I'm on a Mexican radio.
I was pitching this as fuck a reply guy contest. It's hey, many will enter, but few will win, and I won. I'm the reply guy that won the OnlyFans game.
Yeah.
Because I am nobody. The two of you obviously have an audience. People are going to be listening to this the fuck is the weird guy? But can't let the silence win.
You're the Carranza. You actually end up winning, and then me and Brett get assassinated.
Nice. Well, you gotta grip it and rip it. So, because of the whole Rona thing, it's no longer safe to. One of my favorite things to do is loiter around the bus stop and have drifter conversations. And my show is pretty much that. It's a bunch of drifter conversations. That's where I will be positioning myself in the show. But let's get on with it. My name's Nestor, and I host Black Banner Magic podcast. It's crossroads between the ethereal meeting the material conditions of our exoteric existence. And this is a huge crossover episode for me. I got Jake Flores from Pod Damn America,
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, and Breht from Revolutionary Left Radio.
Hello, happy to be here.
I should really up my game and try to get, I don't know, use that Crimson Ghost Cultural Critic podcast theme and like shoot for Boris Johnson next week.
I was gonna say you can use like chaos magic to try to get bigger and bigger accounts on your show.
Well, I think the first move I gotta change the name of the show from Black Banner Magic to Los Espookys of Rojo. Boris Johnson, I'm coming for you. All right. Well, we're going to be covering the 500 years of Mexican colonialism leading up to the Mexican Revolution. You know, it's history for the fellas today.
Well, glad to be here, boys. I have wanted to cover this in some sort of form for a long time. I'm glad we're doing it. Part of the reason that it's so interesting to me is that the Mexican Revolution is, I mean, all politics aside, even just an incredible story that is, way less told than the big one that comes right after it in Russia. And also, I have a piece of myself in this story. I'm descended from someone who we'll get to at some point later on in the podcast. So this is something that I feel kind of a duty to understand and be able to talk about. It's also just very cool. And I don't know. The quarantine has allotted a lot of free time to be able to tackle this as a project. It's profoundly interesting, and I don't know if you could really stretch and make that grand of an argument that it's incredibly relevant to anything that we're experiencing right now. But if you're a history nerd, you will see the various dynamics within the balances of power and the opposing sort of political theories in this story, and you'll see all sorts of Bernie Sanderses and Joe Bidens and DNCs and things like that. Maybe a little bit more literally in battle with each other than what we're experiencing right now. But I'm really glad we're doing this. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for my part, I'd like to echo just how fascinating this history is, how nuanced and complex it is. And even though there might not be specific things that we can readily apply to our current situation, as Jake alluded to, there's just so much here that happens in every revolution and every major class struggle. There are different factions. There are liberals, there's hardcore reactionaries and basically fascists, and there's revolutionaries, and they're all battling out over basically a 10-year period of the Mexican revolutionary period. And there are winners, there's losers, there's everything in between. There's political assassinations, there's U.S. imperialism. So while the specificities of the situation might not be readily applicable, the general structure of class conflict and of revolutionary energies is always applicable, as long as capitalism is the dominant class structure that we're dealing with. And I myself have a little family history tied into this as well. My wife's family is from Mexico. My wife's dad's mother's side, the maiden name is Zapata, and the family lore is that they are direct descendants from Emiliano Zapata. In lieu of any actual like genetic 23andMe type shit, I can't really prove it, but it's a well-known family story, and they state it as casual fact. And so that would mean that my son is a direct descendant of Emiliano Zapata. So whether that's true or not, I choose to believe it's true, and I have a connection to Zapata sort of emotionally from that family history. So I'm happy to be talking about this.
Absolutely,
as well.
And I think people talk about the spirit of Zapata, and I think that'll become more relevant when we get further into the story. Myself, I have a slight connection to it. My stepmom's family fled just a few years after the breakout of the revolution from Guanajuato, which we'll find out plays a big ordeal in the independence from Mexico before the revolution.
Right. And, the other reason I've been thinking about this is because we are going to talk about Espiritismo and spiritualism and this, vague sort of secular mystical concept. And that word spirit it can mean a lot of things, it can mean literally a fucking spooky ghost or whatever. But it also, just on linguistic, or not linguistic, but whatever, just a basic level, it does mean just the vague passion and sort of like motivations that drive a lot of these figures and a lot of these movements. And I was thinking about that also because when I noticed, Brett's got an ancestor in this, and I've got an ancestor on it's really cool. His is a Zapatista, or as a Zapata, actually. Mine worked with the Magón brothers. You hear that and you think, well, that's a really cool coincidence, and then you think, wait, is it a coincidence? Is there some possibility that this is this literal spirit echoing through history? I mean, I didn't know that. I just happened to be a guy who lives a pretty, not similar, but like not unsimilar life to the people that worked with the Magón brothers. Obviously on a much sillier, less, brave and dangerous level. But we'll get into some things that he did that are like, you could make a joke at least about him being somewhat of an early podcaster. I mean, he was literally like a satirist and, ran these newspapers and, was subversive and did it all DIY. So I don't know. I feel as I've read all this history and, become accustomed with it and used it to gather a framework of how a state, is formed and how it affects the people that live in it and how that relates to my life, I really feel this concept of spirit. And I think we should start this story there, because something that I noticed while reading about this and thinking about, Black Banner Pod and all this stuff and what we're going to kind of use as an allegory or like a central metaphor here, I noticed that in the story of the Mexican Revolution, there is something really interesting regarding mysticism. There are different factions that are in conflict with each other in terms of being either, influenced by the Catholic Church and fighting for, even like monarchy, and thus a very ordered and imperialistic version of mysticism. There are also people that are completely anti-mysticism, like the Científicos that we'll get to, that are sort of trying to break with that tradition and what they've perceived to be the negative aspects of it on society. And then there's this third faction and this third direction, which is that, a big part of this story is indigenous people who were interrupted in their lives by colonialism, by the Spanish, which led to all of this, and they had mysticism in these like what do you call it, more agrarian societies, right? And so something that I thought was really interesting, and I think might be a good place to start when talking about this, is Catholic, Mexican, Latin imagery. Specifically, I wanted to talk about the Lady Guadalupe, which you have seen if you're listening to this a million times in your life. I'm sure it's the tattoo, it's the thing on the candle you get at the Mexican grocery store, it's on murals all over town, depending on where you live in the U.S. The one, right? The Lady Guadalupe, the saint lady with the plant behind her and the rays and all that stuff. It's everywhere, and I don't think everyone really knows exactly where it comes from. It's one of those cool images that permeates through our society. So to illuminate that a little bit, if you don't know, it's an example of something that's really interesting regarding colonialism. So the Spanish came, and so, we all know the story. I mean, they came, they killed a bunch of people, they took land, and they imposed Catholicism on indigenous people in Mexico, right? But the thing that's really interesting about this is that indigenous people in Mexico from, the Aztecs and then the people that lived under the Aztecs were kind of resistant to this, and successfully resistant. They really did not take to having this new religion imposed upon them, but they sort of made various, what do you call them, like concessions, right? You could get people to sign on to Catholicism if you allowed them to keep some of their ancient traditions, myths, and images in their new practice of Catholicism. So what was formed was sort of like a fusion between a lot of Aztec stuff and a lot of this traditional Catholic Church stuff. And an example of that is the Lady Guadalupe, right? Lady Guadalupe, what we have now is, this image of this woman who's supposed to look a lot like the Virgin Mary, but she's a little bit darker skinned. She's mestiza, right? And if the Catholic Church is asked to explain it, they'll tell you, well, there were some darker skinned images of this woman in Spain, in the town where a lot of the conquistadors came from, and they saw, when they came to the New World and saw people with this darker skin, they saw it as like a sign, and they said, oh my God, we should use this as, the symbol for this great thing, this great community we started, right? But that's not actually the story. That's just a story the church tells you. The real story is that when they were imposing Catholicism on these people, there was an Aztec myth that sort of wormed its way into this image. And the myth is based around, let me see if I can find it. It's based around this priest named Juan Diego, who was made a saint later on in 2002 because of this story. It revolves around the restoration of a temple in honor of, I think, Coalique is how you pronounce it, which is a woman called Serpent Skirt, who is analogous to Mary's virgin story in a lot of ways. So the Serpent Skirt lady was impregnated in her myth by a ball of feathers that fell on her while sweeping a temple. She was married to Quetzalcoatl and already had 400 kids when this was happening, and they attacked her for cheating on her husband, right? So her kids attacked her because she cheated by getting this ball of feathers falling on her, which got her pregnant. The myth goes that they decapitate her. There's a lot of human sacrifice in Aztec religion. It's very brutal, very gory. Gods are sort of born by being sacrificed. And immediately her fully grown son emerges from her and becomes like the sun, like S-U-N in this myth. That's the origin story for the sun for this specific place and time. And he fights against the children, and he decapitates the attacking daughter and throws her head into the sky, and that becomes the moon. He fights all these other people and throws their heads into the sky, and those become the stars, and then that's the myth of how we have the fucking moon and stars, right? Pretty cool. Now, the reason that this is something that specifically I wanted to bring up has little to nothing to do with maybe the political, grander things we're going to be talking about here. It's just that it's really fucking cool. Serpent Skirt is, as an image, it's a woman who has bird claws for legs. She has eagle eyes on those claw feet things. She obviously has a bunch of rattlesnakes for a skirt. She wears a belt with a skull on it for a buckle. And then she's just nude from the torso up, everything out. And because, she has a fertility symbol. And her torso is also covered in a necklace made of human hands and hearts. On top of all of this, her head and hands have been cut off. So she's just a decapitated woman with all this crazy shit going on. She looks like the end of Hereditary, and she's lurched over in like an attack stance. From her neck hole, there are two snakes sprouting out of her head, like sort of talking to each other. And there's also snakes coming out of her hand holes. Yeah, it's badass. So the funny thing about this story is that later on, some people from the Spanish church actually dug up a painting of this, and they buried it again because they didn't want anyone to know that this is what the Lady of Guadalupe was actually based on, because they said it was like satanic and terrifying. So, whenever you see that symbol, that's what is being, like, carried through history, through the Catholic Church. No matter how much they fought it, there's still, like, a secret image in here, almost like Masonic style or something. Not really for, like, a specific political agenda, but just because these images are the way that these people understood their world. And they had this thing come upon them and try to take that away from them and tell them, no, you're going to understand the world through our symbols and our images. And they survived this. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. The spirit survived after the people died. Let's begin there, right? So this obviously probably plays into what you could say might be something important to the start of this whole story, which is Father Hidalgo and the Cry of Dolores. Does anyone know, like, maybe more details about what led up to this sort of thing? I know that he was involved in sort of a, like I'm describing, a fusion of Catholicism and, ancient mystic stuff. His version of Catholicism, if I'm understanding, also was left. It was radical and sort of included ideas about redistributing agrarian land and stuff like that, which is why his declaration of revolt was so rallying and so powerful.
Yeah, so he wrote the Cry of Dolores in 1810, but before that, he was his whole life he was a secular priest, but he wasn't like the ascetic monk type. He owned multiple haciendas. He was actually really wealthy for a priest, and he believed in like social justice. He was a social justice warrior. He believed that the peasants should benefit from the labor, and because he was illiterate, because most literate people were in the clergy. He taught himself agriculture. He learned the newest agricultural techniques to maximize crop yields. And there were certain crops that the peasants weren't allowed to grow because they were imports from Spain, and that was a huge business. He taught them how to grow olives, how to grow grapes, how to grow all kinds of different crops that were forbidden, and that really pissed off the crown. Hidalgo was an anti-monarchist, which was like heresy for priests, because priests throughout history have always been the backbone of the state's authority. And when he was butting up against the state, butting up against the Catholic Church, and basically he was a rebel priest. He wrote the Cry of Dolores to get the peasants to rise up and topple the monarchy. And him and a few other like key people were gathering supplies, gathering guns, talking to people, spreading the word through proselytizing the ideas of, if you own your own labor, then why do you need a king? The divine right of kings isn't anywhere in the Bible. Show me in the Bible where it says that we need to pay fealty to this guy that came over and said that this is mine now. And one of his major points, even though slavery wasn't like widespread as it was in the U.S., he was an abolitionist, because the haciendados used domestic labor in their homes. They didn't do it wasn't crop slavery. It wasn't like plantation slavery. It was like maids and servants in the house. And he wanted to abolish that slavery. He thought it was an affront to God. And he gives this speech, the Cry of Dolores. Hundreds of people flock around him, and the next morning he gives the same speech to an even bigger crowd, and he whips the crowd up into a fury, and they start marching onto the capital city, Guanajuato. 30,000 people marching. It was like a week-long march, and within a week, their numbers had doubled to somewhere around 60,000. I've seen estimates of up to 90,000, but I think that's exaggerated. But of course, when there's 30, 60, 90,000 people marching on your city, you call up the troops and you have them assassinated. So about a third to a half of that group that was marching, like holding the sign of Holy Mother Guadalupe, marching on, they didn't the mob didn't really see it as an attack on the crown. They saw it as defending the church. They saw it as defending Father Hidalgo. So there was some miscommunication in there, but don't let a good crisis go to waste. Because they were just like half of them were just murdered in the street. Hidalgo had retreated because he didn't want to see people die. That's not why he was rising up. He wanted to topple the monarchy with the power of the people. And they were going to march on to Mexico City, which is south of Guanajuato. But Hidalgo assessed the situation. He realized, I'm not leading these people into a bloodbath. peasant farmers. They don't know how to fight a war against an actual military, a colonial military. So he retreated, but that was his downfall, because a year later, him and the other three main leaders, the three leaders were shot in the back of the head intentionally to disgrace them. Hidalgo had to go to a Spanish Inquisition court, and he was defrocked. He was kicked out of the church. Then he was shot, and all four of them were beheaded, and their heads were placed on the four corners of Guanajuato City Hall, basically, and stayed there for many years, rotting away in the sun as a warning, don't do this again.
Right, that's an image. Another note about the power of images and the role that they play in this, I forgot I had a couple more notes about the Guadalupe thing, is that, this, like I said, the story the church told is that the reason that she was called Lady of Guadalupe was because Guadalupe was the name of that church in Spain where they had a little bit more of a swarthy image of the Virgin Mary, right? Obviously, if you remember the myth I just described, that is something that is, analogous to a fertility myth, right? But there's another explanation that also might be possible, which is that the translation of the Nahuatl word is Guatlasupe, I think. I'm probably butchering it. I don't know how to speak that language, but it means she who crushes the serpent. It's entirely possible that is why they named it that, and that's also very cool. But the other thing is that this image, Guadalupe, came from a myth about restoring a temple, right? And basically the myth is that this other secular priest was visited by the Virgin Mary, and he sort of ignored the call. Like, he was like, no, I'm not your guy, I'm not a good priest, I'm you want to talk to somebody else, yada yada yada. But she appeared to him again and again, and eventually proved that she was the Virgin Mary to him by calling him by his biblical name, right? Because no one else knew it, I think. And his biblical name literally translates to the eagle who speaks. So people think that this myth is why there's an eagle on the Mexican flag. And I think there's another way that the sun plays into this, but I don't know. I'll have to come back to that. But yeah, images. Very cool.
Yeah, so actually, because you're talking about that, actually something really interesting. Earlier you were mentioning coincidences, and I couldn't help think of this when you were talking, because I had no idea that this little part about the Lady of Guadalupe would be brought up in this conversation whatsoever. But weirdly, strangely enough, I'm literally wearing a shirt with the Lady of Guadalupe on right now that I just randomly grabbed out of my closet on the way over here. And yesterday, allegedly, my wife, who is of Mexican descent, we had a little small, basically magic mushroom trip, and the candle that was lit next to her the whole time was one of those tall Lady of Guadalupe candles, and the magic mushroom has been known to play a role in sacred events in indigenous people from Mexico for centuries. It's always been used in sacred and spiritualistic rituals. So it's just funny to think that now that we're talking about this, and I had no idea that we were going to talk about this, the last 24 hours of my life have been, really studded with this imagery of the Lady of Guadalupe specifically, which you can make of that what you will, but it's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, man. No, I'm all for it. It's great. And I think that if I'm going to let my mind wander and entertain this a little bit, I mean, there is also a very... I hesitate to even use this word because it's a bit of a reach, but there's almost like an anarcho-primitivist bent to the, the indigenous and Zapata later on, those people and what they're fighting against in this story. And I almost feel like we're in the end times right now with this whole coronavirus thing. And, maybe we're getting back there, maybe that spirit is reaching out to us because it's the dolphins that are taking over the, the rivers and canals and stuff. Maybe the spirit of the earth is coming back to us, and this life that we live with all of our technology and iPads and laptops and phones is coming to a close. I hope not, but we'll see.
Speaking of the end of the world, so there was the Spanish colonization was being perpetrated by the Habsburg dynasty, the huge-chinned, giant, weird, freaky-looking Jay Leno royalty. they were the Catholic monarchy, and the English monarchy was the Protestant monarchy. That's somewhat of the stem of the Catholics versus Protestants war. But there's an idea of omenology, so deriving meaning from different omens. And in 1577, there was a newly discovered comet that lit up the entire sky across Europe, like from far reaches of Serbia, or not Serbia, Russian Gulag area. I completely spaced on the name of the Siberia.
Siberia.
So from Siberia all the way to the English island, the island of Fasci Island. Anyway, so in 1577, this newly discovered comet blazed across the sky, all across Europe, scared the shit out of every mystic, astrologer, scientist that saw it, because, like, holy fuck, is it going to hit us? And I'll come back to that. But in December 2019, there was a newly discovered comet, just as the coronavirus was being determined not to be just like common flu or really bad flu. A new comet was discovered headed towards Earth. I think it's passing maybe next week or the week after that, but it's a safe distance away, of course. And the man that, when we get to it, Francisco Madero, had also spotted a new comet in 1910, just as the revolution was kicking off. So there's this idea of comet omenology factoring into the Mexican Revolution and the Catholic versus Protestant war and the coronavirus. So hopefully we're not in the end times, but the comments seem to say otherwise. Or at least
fascinating.
Cut myself off real quick here and limit the amount to which I talk about this, because it will be annoying and unnecessary, but I did destroy my mind for many years by watching and reading the Game of Thrones books and TV show. And if you know anything about George R.R. Martin, what he says he based those stories on, he based them on actual history. I think he says it's the War of the Roses. But the entire time I was reading about the Mexican Revolution, man, I could not get it out of my head that he lives in the Southwest, and he has to have read about this because he's a history nerd. And there's a fucking comet in Game of Thrones at the beginning of everything, and there's also this series of events that really parallels what happens with just people trying to get on the damn, the throne of presidency in the story of the Mexican Revolution. So, I mean, I won't do it, but just if you're a nerd and you're into that shit, you can impose some figures on various, fallen revolutionaries and angry generals and all sorts of people in this story. I'll share my theories on Twitter. I won't taint this podcast with it.
If you'll indulge me on a little drifter conversation, speaking of those comments, so if anybody listening is just like, oh, that's three events that just happened to coincide, and say you're reading way too much into it. One of the people that spotted that comment, John Dee, he was an alchemist, a mathematician, astrologer, philosopher, diviner. He was a polymath, but most importantly, he was Queen Elizabeth I's advisor. And beginning in 1570, he was urging her, on behest of the angels he was talking to spread the British influence into the quote-unquote New World, meaning the area that Spain was currently occupying. And he said it was to defend against Catholic encroachment into Protestant Britain, because at that time, Britain was not the major empire it was. In fact, John Dee coined the phrase, the idea of British Empire. So when that comet flew over and every mystic was shitting their pants or their pantaloons, whatever they were wearing, their robes, including Johannes, I think I'm saying this right, Johannes Kepler. He was a German astrologer and astrophysicist. I guess not an astrophysicist at the time, but essentially what he was doing was that. And when he saw this at a young age, it constantly kept his attention to the point where he dedicated his entire life to studying the planets. He eventually founded the laws of planetary motion that proved Copernicus's theories about heliocentric rotation instead of the Earth being at the center of the universe. It was now like Copernicus thought that, couldn't prove it. Johann Kepler did prove it, and a generation later. So anyway, I promise I'm going somewhere with this. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail for Britain, which kicked off the 80 Years' War. They intended to overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and that was exactly what John Dee had seen in the astrological charts he was reading and the angels he was scrying with. Was that the Catholics were going to be coming to overthrow the Protestants. So the British and Spanish monarchy were at war with each other, but also when that 1577 comet went across the sky, there was an Ottoman polymath. He was basically doing the same job as John Dee. He worked for the Sultan Murad III, and when he was tracking the comet, he predicted that it would be the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which mostly came true when the Treaty of Constantinople in 1590 was signed, and they lost a majority of their empire, and they lost it to the Habsburgs, which had overtaken Latin America. So Dee was smart enough to get close to Queen Elizabeth because in just a few years earlier, she had written the Elizabethan Act against conjurations, enchantments, and witchcraft. It was the witch hunt. So I'm bringing all this up because first we need to lay out the material conditions that history says caused the revolution, and not just the out there woo-woo. And the history books say that the cause of the revolution was the Porfiriato. So who wants to know who and what the Porfiriato is?
Maybe let's talk about some events that led right up to it. Quickly though, because there's a lot of history to cover. So after there's sort of an initial Mexican independence, there are a series of like regencies, like council governments. There's a straight up Mexican emperor, and eventually France just comes and pokes its ass into the situation and installs their own emperor, Maximilian. Right. That during that whole time you were just talking about, right? And eventually he's ousted, and the entire time that he's in, on what is now a throne, I suppose, there is Benito Juarez, who does not recognize him, withstands the whole thing, and also endures a civil war between reformists and liberals. So another big theme in all of these conflicts is, there are a few of them, but like one of them is there are these reformists who are conservative who will go as far as to defend the monarchy, the colonization and everything. And there are liberals who are, basically more for like a decentralization. Obviously, they're fighting sort of against this colonizing power. And we'll get eventually into that being stretched into something more akin to federalism, where they're talking, ironically, from the left about like states' rights and shit like that. Juarez endures, and I'm not going to get into the details because there are just so fucking many like overthrows and coups and presidents that last a year or whatever. Check out the Wikipedia page for Mexican presidents. It's insane. Benito Juarez is, I think, officially the 26th president of Mexico. This is pretty early into them being Mexico, and the reason for that is not that there are 23 presidents that came before him that are all different guys. It's literally like Santa Anna every other time, and they're just constantly rotating, and very few of them actually finish a term for various reasons, political and mortal. But this eventually ends in sort of Benito Juarez. Does he die, or does he just not win his election? I can't remember. Porfirio Diaz wins an election, comes in after the interim president, after Juarez, and is running ironically on this slogan of no re-election, because everyone's really worried about there being like a Mexican dictator since they just got rid of a fucking emperor and everything. And you'll see why that's ironic as we get into the Porfiriato, which is the 35-year reign of this supposedly democratically elected president, Porfirio Diaz. He wins every election for 35 years. Obviously, you know, something's up with that, right?
And Diaz fought in the sort of national liberation struggle. Was it to kick out the French? So he was sort of seen as a radical revolutionary figure at one point in his life, and then became the dictator that he's known in history.
Well,
Yeah.
First, it was the Civil War, and then he staved off the French invasion, and he was seen as like a national hero because he saved the people from the French installed Maximilian Habsburg. So yeah, he was popular, but that's why he continued winning.
Almost like without fail, I think every single figure that eventually ascends to the presidency in the Mexican Revolution, not all of them exactly like this, but basically a recurring theme that happens over and over again is that you rise to the presidency on the power of a bunch of people who believe in you as being this reformer and being in revolt, and then immediately become a turncoat once you're in power. And that is absolutely what Porfirio Diaz did. He's like, I don't know, I wouldn't compare him to, well, there's no one in American history to compare him to because we never had a 35-year long dictator. But but he definitely became someone who said no re-election with a bit of an ironic smirk after a while. You know, he was jailing people left and right for making fun of him and stuff, and saying, democracy, no re-election.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of that well-known Bakunin quote. If you took the most ardent revolutionary, vested him in absolute power, within a year he would be worse than the Tsar himself. And it's just sort of gesturing to this fact of like, yeah, you can see these at one point revolutionary radical figures get invested with a bunch of political power and turn to dictators, and in some cases the very things that they, in previous decades fought against. So it is sort of an echo of that Bakunian critique.
Absolutely, and that is why a little bit later in the story we will get to anarchists, and I think it is no coincidence that anarchism found fertile ground in what was happening in Mexico, because even to this day Mexican politics are riddled with corruption, and people seem to understand that this just a fact of life is that the people in power are going to be fucking corrupt. So you can see how that would lead people to go, okay, well, the government just is the fucking problem here, and it's no matter how many times you try it, it will always corrupt.
And something I don't think we've mentioned yet, at the risk of being accused of being fascist adjacent, we have to bring up the social, like ethnic caste system that was installed by Spain that kept a lot of people out of politics. Like even people that owned land weren't allowed to be in politics. So real quickly, they had peninsulares. They were Spaniards that were born in Spain, living in New Spain. They were basically the nobility, land-owning colonizers. Then Criollo were born in New Spain, but they were two Spaniard parents, so they were like first generation. Castizos were mestizos that were mixed with a Spaniard born in New Spain, and then a mestizo is indigenous with Spanish or European ethnicity. Mulatto is mixed indigenous with either African or Spanish, and then the indigenous people who were both pre-Columbian and even pre-Aztec peoples. And only the peninsulares, for most of the time, ran the whole show. The Criollos actually were somewhat supportive of the revolution because they wanted political power as well. So they thought, well, we'll go with the bigger group of people that's going to overthrow the one group, and then we'll see how the Criollos were turning on other people as soon as they could.
Yeah, I mean, like so often is the case in history, a lot of the quote unquote revolutionary figures that we're going to talk about here come from the upper part of the caste system and also obviously the upper part of the class system. There are a lot of people that are educated and able to read a lot of history and theory and stuff, but there are also going to be a bunch of just peasant revolutionaries. But the reason I brought that up is because the caste system is important to understand if you live in America and you think of race in really American terms. Something about colonization of Latin America is that it created this sort of combined class and race system. And so, you have like various people within this system moving from one part of the caste to the other, not like by changing the color of their skin, but like people are trying to appear whiter in a lot of ways to associate with a higher class. It's something that I think about a lot as a pale Mexican. I'm half white. My mom's a white woman. My dad's mestizo, and and I think about it a lot because there is a reason that people try to achieve whiteness because you have more power, right? And so, like, I remember growing up, my dad sometimes would, we'd all be driving in a car and he'd say, like, we're white. And then we'd all look at him and go, well, you're not. Like, you're the one in this car that can't really make that case. But his desire to be white, I think, came from, like, this is still in place, this system. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
That's a pattern that holds in legacies of colonialism the world over, but specifically in Central and South America to this day. When you look at, like the reactionary forces in Venezuela or the Christian fascists who successfully overthrew Morales in Bolivia, right? It's always this deeply connected colonial history of race and class, and it's the colonizers, the descendants of the colonizers that are often the elite, the landed elite that have all the land and that are on top of the class hierarchy basically. And in Venezuela specifically, that very much holds true. There was that incident in Venezuela 2 years ago, I think, where the reactionary fascist forces would just go out and they would look for people of color, and they found a black man and they burned him alive in the street because they saw his blackness as being synonymous with being a Chavismo, with supporting Hugo Chavez and Madero and the Bolivarian Revolution. So that caste of race and class still very much exists all throughout Central and South America.
Yeah, and you see it in Porfirio Diaz being up or higher on the cast, and like Benito Juarez was closer to the bottom, and you didn't talk about it much. And also, so when Porfirio Diaz is in power, he's doing a lot of things that connect to industrialization coming from the north. So he's bringing in, these new inventions and trains and power lines and things like that. And all of this is having a direct effect on the, forcing of people in indigenous communities like Morelos, where Zapata is from. He's bringing in capitalism via technology, and they're resisting it. And the color lines are very direct here. I mean, he's a white man bringing in business and trying to force these people out of their way of life. And so, it's not direct one-to-one, but there is definitely like a indigenous reaction to capitalism and technology coming in.
Yeah, and at the time when Porfirio Diaz was selling off land to U.S. corporations, there was a point when there were so many U.S. corporations that owned land that he started worrying that the U.S. was going to usurp them. So he started playing the British and the French on the U.S. by selling more British land rights, more French land rights. All these Anglo countries were being pitted off each other, but then those countries were obviously taking ancestral lands from people that had grazing rights for millennia, that had paperwork, documented land rights that go back 1,000 years. And during the Spanish colonization, those were actually most times held up in court. Like if a village would come and say, "Hey, these people are taking our land. We have documentation showing we have over 1,000 years on this land. This is ours." They would get ruled in favor for. that stopped with the Porfiriato. It was just who can pay the most and who's going to pay right now.
Right. Porfirio Diaz brought in, outside commercial interests via agriculture through what's called the haciendas, and then the rulers of them, the hacendados. So, like, someone like Zapata lived in what's called a campesino, where the system was, basically hunter-gatherer shit almost. Like, I mean, they had farming, though, but with the thing that comes after hunter-gatherer shit, I guess, more specifically, which is that they had communal farming. Like, you would, everyone would get together on Wednesday and harvest my crops, and then on Thursday we would all get together and harvest Nestor's crops, and then we go around the village like that, and everyone would just distribute their own shit that way. It was not obviously brought in and exploited via someone from the top, but Porfirio Diaz brought in these people who took them over and turned them into haciendas, and those people were called the hacendados. And so all of Mexican land went from being very publicly owned like that via just you live on it, to like 50 rich people own all of them. He also brought in people to mine silver and turned peasants into basically indentured servitudes under a system known as peonage, because silver was what I think money was backed by at the time. This was like really disrupted when what's his face, William Jennings Bryant or something in the U.S. Proposed backing it with gold, and he enforced all of this with a really corrupt political system. So one thing that ended up actually being his downfall is that he didn't have people that were extremely loyal to him. He actually liked to keep people in his government and in his military in conflict with each other as a way of maintaining his own power. And he paid people off, and so he had like these guys known as jefes politicos, like political bosses, literally, who would just sort of keep the rule of law in around the country. And this, like I said, all comes down. It's the reason that the whole thing comes crashing down like a house of cards eventually, because nobody actually fucking likes the guy.
Right. Yeah, and his system of doing that was pan o palo, bread or stick, because you could either give somebody a bunch of land, make them or let them farm it out, let them make a bunch of money, but if they cross you, beat them into the poorhouse or worse yet, a grave. So if you're ruling with an iron fist, you're going to have a bunch of enemies and not many supporters, which comes to find out that's not how you run a country.
Yeah. And you can also just sort of zooming out and thinking about the land sell-off, these terms like primitive accumulation, enclosure of the commons, processes by which capitalism, often in the guise of colonialism, take over territory. And in the case of land, Diaz is selling off land that's been communally, dealt with for centuries, that have long ancestral family lines of people living on these lands, and kicking those people off, indigenous people off their land, and selling it to imperialist, corporations and non-nationals, is a process that takes place in almost every colonial context. And so we see a leader in a country, basically facilitating the enclosure of the commons, kicking people off their land, and doing that just general primitive accumulation process that capitalism needs to get jump-started in a certain area. And so that's exactly what was happening here.
Right, and this comes freshly after, bucking this parasitic monarchist thing. Suddenly it the dynamic of power reforms itself, as it is so wont to do throughout history. This time not through the crown, but through, cash, baby. Should we talk about Madero? I don't want to skip over anything, but this is where things start to get a little bit more lateral.
So, with Madero coming into the picture, occasionally Diaz would claim that he's not going to run for another term. He would say, okay, well, I've been in power long enough. I love my people. I want them to have a say in who runs the country. And then he would handpick his successor and make sure that they won. They would do something stupid. They would screw up, or they would cross Diaz. He would publicly disown them. He's for a lot of people in the Mexican Revolution, it was the only leader they'd ever known. So he's like the father of the country, very patriarchal. And he would come down, and he would publicly disown them, and he'd say, you know what? Mexico needs me. You need me. I can't betray my people. I'm running again. He did that 3 times. And he's like, oh, yeah, you need me. You can't live this way without me. So the last time he did that was in 1908. He gave an interview to an English or not an English speaking newspaper in the U.S. That's redundant. Anyway, it was a paper where he kind of off the cuff said, "No, I'm not running again this time. I am retiring. Take my word, I'm retiring." And either he was slipping in his old age because he was 80 at that time, or he just didn't think that it would be translated into Spanish. But of course it was, and it got spread around. It's called the Creelman Interview if you want to read it. It's an interesting insight into an old man giving up his power without realizing it, kind of like Biden. But the last time he did this fake out, a bunch of people put their hat in the ring. They're like, okay, well, I'm going to run. You said we get open, fair elections. I'm going to run. Well, a lot of times they were groomed. There were a couple of people that were working with Diaz, saying that, oh, well, I will carry on your legacy. We just need new blood in the legislature. And Diaz was fine with that. He'd groom a couple people, but then they would start getting out of pocket, and he's like, "No, you got to go away now. You're not my successor." Francisco Madero, he was running basically unopposed, unimpeded, because he was seen as a lunatic. He was like the U.S. ambassador to Mexico repeatedly called him a lunatic in public and in press. He's like, "Not a lunatic. He's not going to do anything." So nobody's paying attention to him. He's running unopposed until up to the point where he publishes a book in 1909. It's called The Presidential Succession of 1910, the National Democratic Party. And he outlines his political goals of expanding voting rights to everybody, and the idealist view that liberals hold still to this day, saying that you can just vote out bad government. If we get good government, then you'll have a good system. And one of his later plans was land reform, which people were very for, but it was like way down at the bottom. It was like line second to the last. Wasn't really that big of a deal.
Land reform for the Mexican Revolution is kind of like Medicare for all or something, where people kind of run on it, and then when they get in power, don't actually really do it. And you have Zapata kind of being the only person that notices this and getting more and more alienated by it. We'll get to him later. But Madero is a really funny figure because, he's a rich kid. And he's
one of the richest people in Mexico.
Yeah, and his dad's, like this really powerful rich guy, and his kid is just, went to college and became really interested in all this crazy stuff, and, decides to mount this eventual revolt against Diaz, and no one's taking him seriously. And I mean, his parents are really kind of referring to him as kind of a joke and just going like, when are you going to stop doing this crazy thing you're talking about? And eventually he goes north of the border and is deciding to come attack from the upward direction, and his guns don't show up, and nothing's working, and it seems like he's gonna have to call this whole fucking thing off. But eventually the northern rebels fall into his lap, because there are just these roving bands of often unpolitical bandits in the north, and some of them are just pillaging, and they're just living in chaos, and some of them are starting to understand that there is a thing that they're fighting against, which is the rich. But I think before we get to them, we should talk a little bit about this thing that I know you have a lot of information on, Nestor, because I read about half of the book that you sent me. It's pretty wild, which is Madero's Espiritismo. Can you please tell me about that?
Yeah, so keep in mind what Jake just said about going to right across the border and start the revolution. The guns don't show up. The Mexican Revolution doesn't kick off because of Madero, but because of Pancho Villa and other rebels in the north. So that I'll be coming back to that. But Madero studied in Paris and Berkeley at UC, and then in a school in Mexico. So he traveled all over the world. He wasn't really too much of a resident of Mexico until he returned from his studies. So I think that's kind of like a bourgeois thing that people did: send your kids off to foreign country to get educated, come back and take over the hacienda, or the hacienda. And so when Madero was in Paris, he gravitated to like all the latest esoteric writings on spiritual matters. He hung out in seance parlors of Paris, which isn't uncommon for Paris. It was littered with them. It was what's referred to as the Great Occult Revival of the late 19th century. So it was just like going to the movies.
Right. A pretty untold story. Yeah, a pretty untold story in U.S., history books in like school and things like that is that there was a very popular, just kind of spooky, occulty thing people would do. You would go to like spirit readings. Mary Todd Lincoln was really addicted to them after her husband died because she was trying to talk to him. It was popular among the rich. Like people look at tarot cards and think, oh, they're these ancient crazy things or whatever. They were like a thing rich people would just do as a game to play with each other. Before Crowley came and kind of decided to make them mystical, all of this stuff was, depending on who you were, I think probably not super like serious, like a fucking conviction like you would have in Catholicism. It's a cultural thing, man. And so Madero is a rich guy and he gets into this shit because it's really popular at the time. It's the way people in Brooklyn are into astrology right now. He gets into fucking Blavatsky and Crowley and the theosophy, which is a thing that's happening at this time that I've talked about a lot on my show because it's like the origin point of a bunch of different things that are all crazy. Scientology kind of came out of it. A bunch of libertarian psychos. The guy who invented the New School. At one point, they were doing chants in the Church of Theosophy to try to like curse FDR and shit. There's all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Rich people are fucking crazy.
Yeah, and bringing up FDR, Madero is basically the Mexican FDR. If you take FDR and Marianne Williamson and a little bit of Mr. Peanut Butter from BoJack Horseman, that's Madero. But he wasn't just learning it. Like when he went to Paris, he was already on his path to being like this weird occult spooky guy because he had two brothers named Raul. I think he had 15 siblings altogether. He had two brothers named Raul. The younger brother died when he was a kid. I think he was like 6 or 7. He was swinging a stick around inside and he knocked over a kerosene lamp onto himself, burned to death. And Madero spoke to his ghost like all through his life. So he spoke to his younger brother Raul, who his older brother was named in honor of his younger brother, which I find really weird. But so yeah, when he was in Paris, he already had this idea of like talking to spirits. And like Jake said, it was not just Paris. It was across England. It was across the Northeast United States. It was an aristocratic thing to do. It was parlor tricks, basically. And the group that Madero fell into was the Spiritists. And there's two different groups that have similar names: Spiritist and Spiritualism. The kind that was in the U.S. was Spiritualism. It was like Ouija boards, spirit boards, seances. The Spiritists had more of a philosophy and less of a like parlor trick game to it, because they believed that all living beings were immortal spirits, and we only briefly inhabit corporeal bodies. Then we reincarnate, further intellectual and moral and social improvement, go back into a body, try to relive it again. It's similar to Buddhism. But it comes from like a 17th century Christian theologian named Emanuel Swedenborg. And hey, guess where he's from? It's Sweden, right?
Borg.
He's from Borg. So Spiritists differ from Swedenborgism because Swedenborg was deathly afraid of contacting the dead. He thought that they were higher spirits, that you rabble down here living in your trash body. Don't talk to the spirits. They've already ascended. But the Spiritists believed that they could speak to the dead, speak to the spirit of the dead, and pass messages back and forth, get insight, and better themselves by doing so. But Madero also found affinity in the Hindu scriptures of the Bhagavad Gita, which had just recently been translated into Anglo languages when he arrived in Paris.
Yeah, he was a rich kid in college. He read the shit out of the Bhagavad Gita.
The
Absolutely.
Bhagavad Gita, like the son of the song of God, like synthesizing virtue and spiritual liberation. So you start seeing where like this weird idealist liberal idea of like just vote out bad government. You got to have virtue and morals, and don't really play the political game. Just know that if you're on the right path, you'll do the right thing. Shit like that. So then Madero was not really a politician, and everyone knew that he wasn't a politician. So he was a politician on a moral quest. He's basically a sock dim. He was a very, very, very rich sock dim. And when he returned to Mexico in 1899, he joined a Spiritist group and claimed to have saved his mother from typhoid fever by speaking to her spirit, providing homeopathic treatments, and then she survived typhoid fever. I think maybe she just got over the typhoid fever. But in 1909, he and his wife became vegetarian. They stopped drinking. They were teetotaler. They were operating a soup kitchen and providing scholarships, like all the good things that these rich liberals say they want to do. Like they want to help the poor. They want to give their money away. Well, Madero and his wife were actually doing those things. Luckily, they had a lot of money to give away, so they never became poor. But when Madero read that Diaz wasn't seeking re-election, his dead brother Raul, who burned himself because he was an idiot, he told him that he needed to run for office and do his charity work within the state, make the state do the charity work, is why he was running, because it was a moral imperative that the state provide for the people. And so in 1910, he's running this campaign, and everybody's laughing. He was like, "Oh, look at this weird guy!" Like, there's cartoons from the time and where he's wearing like a big Swami hat, like the Johnny Carson thing.
Yeah,
I don't remember what that was called, and I've only seen YouTube clips. But anyway, like making fun of him. It's like, oh yeah, this weird guy talking to ghosts, telling him to run for president. Yeah, that's cool. It's like Vermin Supreme running for president. And but then he starts like actually doing these things, like writing out a plan, like how after the revolution, or actually at the time it was presidential succession. When he wins the presidential succession, you'll have basically a welfare state. And that was far beyond what Diaz wanted coming after him. So he threw him in jail. In the 2 weeks that Madero spent in jail, he channeled a book, which is the Spirit Manual. He channeled this. He didn't write it himself. He said he did not write it. He didn't even sign his name to it. He signed it a pen name Bhima, because Bhima was writing it. It's Bhima. Yeah. And he wrote an entire book. He was only in jail for 2 weeks because Diaz put him in jail, stole the election, let him out of jail. But he was supposed to stay in the state of San Luis Potosi, and he snuck out of there, went to Houston. Like Jake has said on Twitter, everybody goes to Houston to plot a plan against the government.
That's San Antonio, actually, but
San Antonio. Oh, okay. I've only been to both like 24 hours at a total, so I don't know Texas at all. But the Mexican Revolution is being planned in Houston. The plan of San Luis is saying at exactly 6 p.m., November 20th, 1910, the revolution will begin. He was using his Spiritist circles to like spread this message around. So, and these weren't just like little parlor, like 20 friends getting together. There's like thousands of people doing this in big like tents and fairgrounds. So he's using that as a political platform now. He's got all these people that are already there to listen to some far out bullshit. And then he's like, also, we need to throw the government. We need to overthrow the government. And they're like, yeah, fuck yeah, dude. Who told you that? Bhima told me. Like, you're not going to question Bhima now, are you? and this is why the U.S. ambassador constantly called him a lunatic, because that's lunacy. It's like, that's an incredible grift to like go to these places and like, let me read your palm, let me read your tarot cards. Bhima says we need to overthrow the government, so get your guns, let's do it. And now the specific date of the revolution, history books are all constantly not sure of why there was such specificity for that. They say, oh, well, maybe he was a lunatic, so that's why he chose this very specific time, because a revolution doesn't have like an appointment. You don't put it in your date book to throw a revolution. But the reason that Madero did that was because he was using electional astrology. And in short, I've already rambled a bunch, but in short, electional astrology is the method of tracking the most auspicious day for the best outcome of an event. So using the traits of like metaphorical traits of planets and placements to the hour in relation to cycles, eclipses, ingresses, whole bunch of shit. But Madero is about as knowledgeable in astrology as I am, and neither one of us are experts. But we've both picked up a passable amount to be able to like sort of do it. So on November 20th, 1910, at 6 p.m. in Mexico City, Mars was 10 degrees in the hour of Jupiter. And I think most people know that like Mars is associated with like the Red War. It's the war planet. But Jupiter has the traits of luck and success. And Jupiter is what's called a benefic planet, and Mars is a malefic planet. If you have a malefic planet in the hour of a benefic, then ideally this should be an auspicious time to wage war, because Jupiter aids you in whatever you want to do. But Jupiter's confidence can be overstated, and Madero's crew definitely got lost in the dark riding across the border on November 18th on the way to the revolution. When they finally met up with what they were expecting to be thousands of people armed to the fucking teeth, it was his uncle and 10 people. But the revolution actually did take off on that day and that time, on November 20th, 1910 at 6 p.m. in the northern states. Rebel groups, completely unaffiliated with Madero, had no Maderista ideas, broke out into revolt. And one of those rebels was Pancho Villa in Durango. So the electional astrology did show that it was auspicious. It was an auspicious day to use warlike Mars and lucky Jupiter to wage a war. Just wasn't Madero's war.
Yeah, and this sounds crazy. I mean, we know this because there's this writer. Well, I'll probably link the book, obviously, in the show notes. I don't have it on hand. It's in another window or something, and I've got a million notes out in front of me. But there's a writer who went to Mexico and just went through his library and found this book, and he wrote all this stuff in the damn book. And no one's really bothered to translate it into English until now, or until recently.
And so she was the first one to translate it in 2013. First time it's been in English. And interesting side note, the reason that she was able to get access to his library is because her husband was the deputy director of the IMF for the presidency of who was it? Nieto? Is that? I don't think that's right. But yeah, and he barely won. People think that he stole the election from AMLO. Lopez Obrador.
Okay, let's move forward a little bit, because this causes him to to just out of luck, or the fucking stars or whatever, end up coming upon these things that'll be these great forces, these great weapons for him, these generals like Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa is this I think he's not as much of a peasant as maybe the legend is. He's a man with a legend around him for sure, and for good reason. I mean, he's an incredible fighter. His entire story through these battles is hijacking trains and blowing shit up with dynamite. He fucking, at one point, we're gonna move around a little bit laterally here, but to skip forward a little bit, he fights for Madero, and then Madero eventually wins, and becomes president, and Madero's presidency falls apart because he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's too moderate. He's kind of a centrist. I think of it a little bit like an Obama, like he just promised a bunch of shit, and then he just both sides to everything. And Madero's got this general, Huerta, who's like, this fucking drunk, angry, crude, violent asshole who just wants power. He just thinks militarily. And, Villa is still working for Madero, and he's working with Huerta, and Huerta is like trying to get rid of Villa at one point, and so he throws him in, or he arrests him for, something trumped up, like, oh, you took a horse and you didn't have a license for it or something, and he's gonna execute him. And Madero isn't president yet. He's still interim president because he's, a Boy Scout, and he's, we're gonna have an election and shit. So he's like, well, I can't do anything for you, but he hears about it, and he eventually, in the nick of time, sends an order in to not execute Madero. So he slips him from the noose, right? Like, right as they're about to kill him. And Madero saves Pancho Villa, is what I'm saying, from Huerta. But instead of, Villa doesn't get fully saved, though. He still has to go to prison because, like I said, Madero's a Boy Scout, and he's like, oh, we got to, follow the rule of law. So Villa's in jail, and this is my favorite part of the whole story, I think. Villa's in jail, and he's getting super radicalized. He's reading a lot of theories, also reads The Three Musketeers and Don Quixote and shit. He's bored, and he essentially starts talking to his jailer, and he convinces his jailer eventually to help him break out. The jailer brings him a suit, and he opens the gate, and Pancho Villa fucking leaves in a full suit, right? And he travels to Los Angeles. And he decides in Los Angeles, he's kind of mad at Madero, but then Madero gets killed. And when he gets killed by Huerta, he decides, man, I fucking love Madero. That was my boy for life. I have to avenge his death. And so he decides he's going to overthrow Huerta, the entire Mexican government. He just decides this from Los Angeles. And he decides to start doing it with like 6 guys, like a 7-8 man gang. He just starts a fucking street gang. And he walks back to goddamn Mexico with like these 8 guys. One of the 8 guys is the jailer. Because he was just, Pancho Villa was that cool that dude quit his job and joined him. It's so fucking funny. So Madero, or Pancho Villa, rather, I feel like move these names around a little bit, but Pancho Villa is this guy with these legends around him and shit. And at first he starts against all odds, and it doesn't look like it's going to work out, but eventually he just fucking culminates by winning all these battles in an unlikely way into forming this thing called the Division del Norte, which is this big band of, soldiers. But there's also like, there's entire families traveling with him in this big caravan that he's just driving down the north in. There's like women who are fighting, even though he kind of doesn't want them to because he's still a misogynist. There's children. There's like a film crew from America that's filming him, and he's the star of his own movie that's shown in America, which is crazy because later on he fights America. Incredible figure. Yeah, you can't even see it anymore. So
there are hilarious like old cartoons of when the U.S. finally went after Villa, which we might get to in a little bit, but of like, I mean, hilarious but outdated and also weirdly racist cartoons of like Uncle Sam jumping over the border with Mexico with a gun in his hand, chasing Pancho Villa around. So he made a lot of enemies. And just to zoom out and help people catch up with the timeline here, Diaz is ousted from power, and he has to leave and just go to France, never come back to the country. That was in 1911. Madero gets elected president in 1911, and his close first top-notch general Huerta ends up assassinating him 3 years later, and then takes the presidency over. And so now we're in 1913 through 1914 is where Huerta is the president. So just to catch people up on that basic timeline.
Absolutely. One more thing about the Villa's just cowboy legend thing is a couple of things. His nickname was the Cockroach. He is a Game of Thrones character, and the song La Cucaracha is about him. And
wow.
Yeah, it might be a folk thing. It might not be 100% possible to prove that.
There's a lot of variations.
Yeah. And
Bigger in the revolution with like every faction had a verse that was like, fuck you, you're stupid.
yeah, this is during a time when like, you know, songs would travel around culture like that, like around society. It was really fucking cool. It was a little remnant of the oral tradition before we all just could communicate all the time, right? Before all those power lines came in, right? And he also was very popular because he was a Robin Hood figure. So, like I said, he was not as political at the beginning, but when this started happening, he would start to take towns. And when he took a town, he would order his men. Like, he was one of those generals that would say, no, you cannot rape, you cannot pillage, you redistribute this shit and you give it back to them. And that is what made his power grow, because people started to realize, oh, there's this, like, we should get behind this guy. There's actually a reason for this. This isn't someone who's trying to exploit us. It's the exact opposite, right? And so for this reason, he starts to, like, word of him starts to travel across, you know, the Mexico City down to the state of Morelos, south of it, where Zapata is rising. Do you think, Brett, maybe you could tell us about Zapata?
Yeah, so Zapata was basically an organic peasant leader. He was sort of thrusted forward as the leader of the peasants and indigenous people in the South. So if you think of Pancho Villa up north doing a lot of crazy shit, Zapata was in the South doing slightly less crazy shit, but basically, you know, doing raids against their enemies and fighting for revolution as opposed to basic reform. And this is somebody, Zapata, who really comes from the lower classes, unlike somebody like Madero, who is, you know, a liberal, wealthy, landowning, basically elite, but also a reformist. Madero was too liberal for the conservatives, and he was too, you know, conservative for the revolutionaries. And so Zapata was really the face and the leader of these of the revolutionary energies from the South, and a peasant leader himself. So I don't really know much about his connection with Pancho Villa. They operated together a lot, depending on who was in the presidency and who were their enemies at the time. But both of them were really representatives of the revolutionary, left wing, influence from anarchism, etc. They were the face of those movements. And I know Zapata himself actually even wrote a letter once to Lenin during this time. We don't know if it ever got to Lenin, but there was an attempt to communicate even across international lines and sort of connect up those revolutionary struggles. So that's at least of interesting note.
Yeah, Zapata started off as a peasant. Like, he just was a farmer, and they were fighting the hacendados, and eventually he was just the guy who would show up and kick their asses in the field. And eventually in Morelos, they made him, like, their representative. They were like, this guy's fucking awesome, right? And so as he started to fight on behalf of this thing, he's defending his sacred home of Morelos, he started to become more theoretical, because really, like, a lot of his fight is not that specifically anarchist. Like, a lot of the times it seems like he's just trying to get them to fucking leave his state alone so they can just keep living the way they're living. But he does read and become radicalized at some point, and he reads, like, the history of the French Revolution, for example, and sort of cites the Jacobins as an inspiration and, something that they need to do, right? But he has an interesting relationship with Pancho Villa in that they hear word of each other, and they're sort of communicating and coordinating throughout this whole thing. And I don't know if we're going to get through the entire history just for time, but eventually, way later in the story, when they've both allied with Carranza, who comes down way later in the story. Zapata's this guy who, like, he fought for Madero, and that was the last time he fought for, like, a leader like that, until later on he worked with Carranza, but he fucking hated Carranza. It was a tenuous allyship, him, Pancho Villa, and Carranza, when they were trying to overthrow Huerta. And so Villa and Zapata had not met each other, but they've been communicating and hearing legend of each other, and they finally meet way, way, way further into the story, like near the end of it. And when they meet for the first time, it's interesting. There's a great photograph of them. They're kind of awkwardly hanging out with each other. And Pancho Villa is this big, boisterous, crazy, tall, kind of lighter-skinned guy. Villa's this really intense. Zapata's this really intense, darker-skinned guy with, like, the big sombrero and the fucking, what do you call him? the silver buckles and the bandolier and everything. And at first they like don't know what to talk about. They're just like, hey, big fan, we finally meet. And eventually Zapata orders a fucking shot of cognac to try to break the ice, and Villa doesn't drink, but he doesn't want to tell him that, so he like drinks it, and then he starts coughing and shit, and it's really awkward. And then like they're just like, Jesus, this is going terribly, right? And then they both just start talking about how much they hate Carranza, and a friendship is born, over just fucking hating this other guy that they're working with. But Zapata is really interesting because he really doesn't bend the way everyone else does. He doesn't compromise, and eventually he's killed by Carranza's men. And his legend lives on, though, because he fucking didn't compromise, and he didn't do this shit where you get into power. He didn't want to be, the president or anything like that. He really was fighting for land reform, he was fighting for social reasons, not political reasons. That's the distinction that's kind of important in a lot of this. And just for time, maybe we can sort of circle back to some things. But the third figure I really wanted to get to in this whole story is the one that is left out of a lot of Western, or not Western, but like just a lot of conventional tellings of the story of the Mexican Revolution, which is Ricardo Flores Magón, who is this guy who's, he's not middle class, but he did go to school. He's from southern Mexico in Oaxaca. He's from a town called, let me find it. He was born in San Antonio Elo Chitlan, which is now named after him. It's his name is tacked onto the end of it, which is crazy. His town's named after him, and you never hear about this guy, He was radicalized in school. He grew up during Diaz and, worked for student groups and, protested against Diaz, and he read a lot of theory. His main influence was Kropotkin. He loved Conquest of Bread. He wrote for this publication called Democrata, and eventually, and this is an incredible detail, he wrote for a publication called El Hijo del Ahuizote, which means the son of Ahuizote, which is this Aztec like dog creature that has like a hand on its tail and spikes on its back and shit. And I'm not sure, but I think that the joke was the son of a bitch, like it's son of a dog creature thing, because it was a satire newspaper. So Flores Magón wrote in like the fucking Onion, and he got thrown in jail a bunch of times for making fun of Porfirio Diaz in it. The dude was a fucking comedian, an anarchist. He rules. And then eventually he founds and edits Regeneración, which is his anarchist newspaper. And he writes it with a few of his brothers and a bunch of people around him. And it's really dangerous. He keeps getting thrown in jail by Diaz for insulting the president is the crime or whatever. He eventually has to flee. It's like, all right, this isn't going to work in Mexico. And so he flees to San Antonio, and then LA, and then St. Louis, and eventually he has to go to Canada to get away from Porfirio Diaz, and Diaz is still able to get the U.S. authorities to throw him in jail. But during all this time, when he's moving around and publishing Regeneración, he is organizing with the Wobblies. He's organizing these miners' strikes and things that, tragically kind of don't really work out. And he's kind of like a Stalin in certain areas where like he just keeps getting his fucking printing press broken by the Pinkertons and shit, and just has to bust out of jail and fucking set it back up and keep making the damn newspaper. He's a podcaster. So he also, eventually does get behind a couple of popular uprisings where he tries to attack Diaz, and he attacks him in. Actually, I'll get to that in a second. We should start about the PLM. He founds this party that's a low-key anarchist political party, but it's called the Liberal Party. It's called the Partido Liberal Mexicano. And he says that the reason it's not called the Anarchist Party is because of branding. Like, he's like, they won't come with us. We have to trick these people into, getting on board, which is like, does that sound fucking familiar?
Mm-hmm.
And so he founds this party, and he gets behind these uprisings, and, he tries to attack Porfirio Diaz a couple times. He doesn't really actually get a revolt off the ground, but one of them, it happens in 1906. And in 1906, one of his men, who is also a writer for Regeneración, named Juan Jose Arredondo, teams up with his partner Trinidad Garcia, and they overtake Juarez, Mexico, in the northern state. This is my great-great-great-grandfather.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really cool. They took the main plaza for a day, and they held it, this is important, by cutting the telephone lines and expropriating money from the bank. And I think this is a really cool detail, because there are these two veins in the whole story of the Mexican Revolution, which are fighting against the industrialization, the technology that is the mechanism by which all of this, property and capitalism permeates itself, and obviously redistributing the fucking wealth, right? And they had one brief moment of glory where they were able to do both of those things, and then they got their ass kicked, right? This is my grandmother's grandfather, or great-grandfather. I talked to her about it, and she told me that she didn't even know really the story until, her grandmother, who she was raised by, started talking about it later on in her life, and eventually she was interviewed by a magazine in the 60s, or someone came knocking at her door about it, and she started to realize this, and then we started to look into it, and it's really funny, because I think she thought, I wasn't going to like this guy, and because, generational shit, they don't think like we do. This is the coolest thing I've ever heard in my fucking life. I'm obsessed with it. But I'm still really early into really researching the life of this guy, so if anyone's listening to this and they speak and can translate Spanish better than me, please help me out, because I'm from a generation of fucking Mexican immigrants where we had to not speak Spanish, so my Spanish sucks. I'm doing my Duolingo, but I don't think I have the fucking time. But Magón and his people are really interesting because he is the guy who really tried to bring in anarchism with a capital A into Mexico. He met with Emma Goldman, he communicated with all these other intellectuals. He really went from someone who was just a college student to someone who really, really, really tried to fight all of this with information, He kept getting thrown in jail over his life and would get out and just immediately go back to work about it. I think there was another uprising in 1911. And at one point, when Madero was in revolt, way, way, way early back before he became president, when Madero was still a ridiculous, force in the north that wasn't even really banded with the rebels yet. Actually, no, this was after Madero it was almost to the presidency. Sorry, got that wrong. Madero convinced Magón's men, or tried to convince them rather, to fight for him by saying that Magón had agreed to be his VP. So this guy was almost vice president. But the thing is, Magón had never agreed to be his vice president. He was lying. Because Magón was in jail and he couldn't communicate with his people. So he couldn't say, this is fucking bullshit. I don't believe in what Madero's talking about. Madero fucking hated, or Magón fucking hated Madero. He thought he was a lib. So his name was on the ticket and he was in jail and he didn't even fucking know it. And Madero was lying about it. It's crazy. He eventually died in jail after he was arrested under the Espionage Act. During all of that shit, the shit that Eugene Debs got arrested for and stuff. Also, he communicated with Eugene Debs in the U.S. He died in his jail cell. He said he was sick, he had diabetes, and some people think he was assassinated in there eventually, That's, I think, pretty much all I've got from Magón.
So yeah, I think what I take away from this entire story is just the deep complexity of the situation. When we talk about the Mexican Revolution, we're not talking about a necessarily singular event separated from the rest of history with a specific starting date and an ending date, but we're really describing a period of conflict between multiple different parties, multiple different interests. As I said, U.S. imperialism popping its head in the picture as well. And so this entire period from 1910 to 1920, roughly, was really foundational for what came after in Mexico, and the constitution that arose out of it, even given the assassination of people like Zapata. The constitution that came out, I think in 1917 it was at the time perhaps the single most progressive constitution in the world at that time. So, a lot of what happened at that period of time is really instrumental, not only to the rest of the history of Mexico, but really had implications for the entire world, and was sort of a microcosmic example of bigger struggles that were happening the world over. So fascinating history. We'll never be able to cover it all. I urge people to look into this story, because the Mexican Revolution, that historical period, it's kind of like fractals. The deeper you look in, the more nuance, the more complexity, the more information there is. So I hope people check that out. And if they're interested in just a more straightforward history of the revolution itself, we do have an episode on Revolutionary Left Radio called The Mexican Revolution and the Zapatistas, which just sort of go through that history and then talk about its influence on the movement of the Zapatistas, which are still in existence right now.
I guess, without really going through event by event, the sort of story of what happens after Madero is murdered, I just wanted to talk about some broad historical resonances, some things that actually made it out of this whole conflict. Because, when Madero is murdered and then Huerta installs himself, all hell breaks loose, and then the real fucking story begins. You have all these conflicts and all these tenuous alliances and things, and all these people competing for the presidency, and then having coups against them and stuff like that. I mean, we didn't even get to like the fucking 10 days. But I guess the main broad stroke through this whole thing, the broad vein, I would say is interesting about it in regards to other revolutions, is probably the federalism, the anarchism, and the anarcho-syndicalism. This is not really like a Russian style vanguard communist situation. It's interesting. They're fighting against centralized power, because that's the thing that has kept them down for so long, right? And so you have Zapata and you have Magón with the Wobblies sort of arguing for just a return to this decentralized place where all these states would have their own their own power. And I don't know, it's like kind of a tragic story, because they don't really get it, but because they fought so hard for it, you do see things later on in the presidencies of like like Calles and then Cardenas eventually, who nationalized oil, and there's like a national bank, and so there are these reforms that get made, and like they do eventually get some land reform done, and it's interesting because it's not radical enough for the Zapatistas, and it's too radical for the rich. But they basically put the state in control of land, so it eliminates the hacendado system, but it also, it's just the fucking government is running it now or whatever. So they never really achieve the full destruction of the government that they want. I don't know. I don't really know where to land with this. We never really get back to where we want this to be, which is egalitarian. It's almost like a thing you look at and you go, I guess, fuck. Maybe we are to resign to the fact that it will never exist again. Or maybe we become Zapatistas and carry on this fight against all odds, because you do see Zapata's name become reinvoked decades and decades later in 1994 when NAFTA's passed, and these indigenous activists in Chiapas are aware of the disastrous effects that the North American Free Trade Agreement is going to cause on their rights to their own fucking land. And so they call themselves the Zapatistas, not because they're directly linked to the old Zapatistas, but in homage, in like the way the Jacobin is called Jacobin, I don't know. I have no idea how this relates to coronavirus. I don't know. I guess like the coronavirus is the big bad that comes after government, like we were describing. The crown, and then the fucking capitalists, and then the government, and then now we're just fighting a virus. And we are all cordoned off into our little tiny states and learning to be self-sustaining and growing our own vegetables and shit again.
The corona being the crown, so maybe we're headed towards the monarchy of the coronavirus.
Oh my God, the corona is a crown.
Yeah.
That's why it's called that. Oh no. Oh fuck, we're back.
Got it full circle.
All right. Yeah, I think that's probably a good stopping point. I'm definitely not done researching this or reading about it. There's a lot of details that are really great that I didn't really get to. I mean, there's at one point there's like fucking this guy Magón is like thinks he's defeated in battle, and he goes to pull out his gun to kill himself, and his gun doesn't work because his assistant had accidentally taken the ammo out. And then he wins the battle. It's fucking crazy. Craziest story ever fucking told. This needs to be made into now they'd ruin it. I was gonna say a TV show, but it would suck. I don't know. Read your history books, people.
It would just end up being the Three Amigos, but 90 minutes longer.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should probably wrap up, and this will not be the last we ever talk about this, but obviously thanks to Breht for coming on, and we should plug stuff.
Thank you so much for having me on. I love this collab. If anybody wants to find out more about my work, you can go to revolutionaryleftradio.com, and it's all there.
Nestor, what do you got?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter, harvest_goth. I host Black Banner Magic. It's Anarchist magic podcast about overthrowing the state with the power of the mind. Woo! Got a Patreon. It's got one patron, so it's the third time I've started it. I keep deleting my Patreon because I'm like, fuck this. I'm not good at talking. I'm bad with the words. I'm gonna stop that. So I delete my Patreon, and then it's like, shit, there was money connected to that. And other than that, I am in the preliminary stages of writing a book. It is a true crime book about a Satanist murder in my hometown. So that probably won't be out for like 2 years. So keep that in the back of your mind because you'll never remember who I am after this. What do you got?
Cool. Yeah. Listen to my podcast if you're listening to this on one of the other. We're cross broadcasting this or whatever on everyone's feed, but my show is called Pod Damn America. If you don't know, leftist comedian podcast thing. Sign up for our Patreon. It's my main job right now, my only job really. If you are into this and you want to hear more bonus episodes and everything, I also have another show called Why You Mad, which is me and my friend Luisa Diaz, who is an anthropologist and comedy booker. We talk a lot of theory and stuff and a lot of stand-up comedy, sort of try to connect the two. That's maybe the mission of the show. What does Lacan have to do with the Red Fox wash your ass bit? Listen to that show to find out. And my handle on Twitter is Feral Jokes, FERALJOKES. It's an anagram for my name, Jake Flores. That's my handle on everything. I used to be a stand-up comedian before, we stopped being able to go outside. So maybe someday I will do that again. I'll probably have a new album coming out soon that I recorded before coronavirus. And yeah, I don't know, man. Thanks for listening. I forgot to even mention like my Homeland Security thing parallels with Flores Magón. Oh fuck, I'll get to that later.
And you're reading Little Women.
I am. I gotta get back to that.
I started realizing that you people are paying you to read a lot, so I think somebody out there has like a sapiosexual fandom kink.
Yeah. Am I the findom or am I the pay pig? I can't tell. But I'll keep reading Little Women, no matter what whatever what the answer is. Because I started reading it as a joke, and now I'm kind of into it. It's kind of a good book. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Nestor.
All right, well, thank you for coming on again.
It's finished.
Kiss the KMR